Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Policing in America podcast. Today, we have a wonderful guest, Professor Lois James out of Washington State University. Professor James and I get into a whole host of topics in policing that revolve around police performance, a little bit on bias, and mostly on sleep and the decline in human performance as it relates to sleep and how that intersects with policing. This was a hour-long podcast, and I feel like we just scratched the surface. So I'm going to be reaching out, see if we could do a part two. And if you have any questions that you want, please email me on the Policing in America website because I can email Professor James. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the episode. And if you do, please subscribe, like it, share it, and we'll see you on the next one. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Policing in America podcast. I have with me today a very special guest, and I'm so excited to be speaking with Professor Lois James, who is a professor out of Washington State University College of Nursing. Professor James focuses a great deal of her work on bias, sleep, stress, and how all of those characteristics sort of coalesce under the performance during sleep deprivation and in high stress situations. I used a lot of Professor James's work in my own dissertation and became a big fan and just so excited to have you on the show. There's much more that Professor James has done and is doing. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. You can read her entire bio, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it just at that one. Professor, anything you wanted to add?
No, that sounds great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to jump right into it. So a lot of conversations I have with officers, they get frustrated when it comes to certain police training, and especially the bias training. It seems as though we have hit a critical mass on this. And I often wonder if we're at the point of diminishing returns, because we as a profession have spent billions on training officers on their implicit bias. And I don't know if it's yielded any kind of return on investment that is somewhat significant. But so holding that constant, moving to sleep and sleep deprivation, I don't know if we're spending anything aside from maybe people like myself who know this and try to implement certain ways, but certainly nothing on a broad scale, and certainly nothing at the federal level, like policy-wise. Every police agency, or most of the big ones for sure, have policies on implicit bias and policies on biased policing or some derivative of, with consequences. I don't know many that have policies on sleep deprivation, the way the airline, trucking, shipping, rail car does. And I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating question. And you're right, the kind of the fatigue risk management strategies that we see being so kind of prevalent in some professional groups such as aviation and so on, really are, I don't want to say in their infancy, because there are some departments who've been kind of focused on this for quite some time, but they're few and far between. I think that, what we often see is this battle or this struggle between the idea that we can only focus on one thing, right? We either focus on what's good for the community or we focus on what's good for the department. And for me, that's such a misnomer, because what's good for the department is good for the community. And what's good for the community should be good for the department. So, we know from a great deal of science that well-rested officers who are in control, who are managing their stress, who are managing their sleep, who are managing burnout and cynicism and so on, are going to be much better able to manage their biases, right? So, that kind of training honestly has the potential to be just as beneficial for how officers interact with community members as implicit bias training does. And one of the big problems, and just like you said, so much money goes into this, there's really been minimal testing to see how effective any training is. And I don't want to just, this isn't just an implicit bias training problem, it's any police training. And one of the things that that I focus my career on is trying to address that, developing fatigue management training and then testing it, developing implicit bias training and then testing it. So here in a little bit, I'll certainly share some of the results of those studies, because I think, there's some promising work coming out of that field.
And this is, and you are an expert on this, and for the listeners, I'm going to have links to a lot of these studies that we're talking about. You have one titled "The Stability of Implicit Racial Bias in Police Officers," and can you talk a little bit about how sleep sort of interweaves itself into these normal human phenomena of bias?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually going to take just a tiny step back, for listeners who, I mean, I think most people are kind of familiar with the concept of implicit bias now and what it means, but for the most part, our implicit biases are kind of largely subconscious or semi-conscious, and essentially what they are is a kind of a fingerprint of our upbringing, of society, of our kind of core values and beliefs, our family, our friends, and so on. And unfortunately, it's unavoidable. Everybody has implicit biases of some shape or form, just because of the type of society that we have. And unfortunately, those are often, not exclusively, but those are often based around race, as race is one of the more kind of prevalent or obvious differences between people, right? And an implicit bias at its core, at its most fundamental core, comes from our evolutionary survival tactics, right? I mean, in the ancestral realm, it was extremely beneficial to fear and distrust people who didn't look like you, because likely they posed a threat. So, I mean, despite the fact that now we live in very kind of multicultural and diverse societies to some degree or other, depending on where you are, but it is no longer beneficial to fear and distrust people who don't look like you. However, I mean, it's no longer particularly beneficial to fear some of the predatory animals that we used to have very good reason to fear. And yet most of us, if we came face to face with a tarantula, are probably going to be pretty alarmed. Yes. So, unfortunately, these are deep rooted kind of evolutionary phenomena. But the way that sleep and stress kind of factors into this, most of us are actually pretty good at managing our internal processes and controlling our behaviors, right? And especially officers who receive a great deal of training in terms of how you interact with people, in terms of what's professional, what's appropriate, what's not, de-escalation, procedural justice, implicit bias, so on and so forth. When an officer is not overly stressed and not overly fatigued, chances are they're going to be able to access those skills, right? When they're not, when they're under an extreme kind of fight or flight response, a sympathetic arousal response, and especially if they don't have, their resources are depleted because of sleep deprivation and so on, they're just going to be less likely to respond from a cognitive thinking, rational place, and they're going to be more likely to be reactive. And that's what that paper found, is that, under sleep deprivation, the ability to kind of manage or override, especially anti-Black implicit bias was reduced. So that's one of the reasons why I think that, that type of training can be very beneficial for implicit bias.
So there's two things about this that I'm thinking of, and I want to pull on the thread a little. So the first is the idea behind the sleep alone. So the training is there, and it's almost counterintuitive. Your paper talks about how chronic sleep deprivation can take this phenomena and allow us to not control for it or mitigate it or allow it to influence us more than it should. And we give that training to officers who are largely sleep deprived because they work at night, but then they got to come in during the day for training. So how much of that training is actually being absorbed? How much of that is hitting long-term memory? How much of that is actually hitting a space in the brain that is going to be useful and possibly drawn from later in the form of memory? Mm-hmm. And number two, we fail, I believe, as a profession. And I've been doing the last year of my work and training has been focused on teaching officers to critically think. And it is very, what's the word? It's promising to see how officers respond to training when I just give them the basic understandings of Kahneman's System 1, System 2 processing of the brain. And that's what you're talking about, right? The system two thinking, this amygdala, like that part of the brain is alert and awake, and it's basically driving the machine that is the brain. And we want them in that system one, that prefrontal cortex, the cognitive logical processing. Is that am I explaining that correctly?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I often kind of characterize it as the accelerator and the brake, right? You know, I mean, yes, the accelerator is always going to be important, but the accelerator absence the brake and absence that kind of prefrontal cortex saying, you know, no, it's not a weapon. It's just a wallet, right? I mean, that right there is kind of, you know, why unfortunately, we're in, at least partially in the predicament that we're in terms of some of the distrust in the profession and some of the real concerns about kind of abuses of power and so on and so forth. And we look at these incidents, these kind of catastrophic mistakes, and you think, how in the world could that possibly happen? And the really kind of scary thing is you know, it's very easy to see how, I mean, not just, you know, that doesn't by any means kind of excuse it, but it's very easy to see how this can be explained. If somebody is no longer, you know, operating from that prefrontal cortex, the human is always going to be inclined to protect oneself and so on. And it's always going to be inclined to, you know, to push on that accelerator and think with that lizard brain, right? The amygdala.
Right. Yeah. And that is the difficult thing to have explained to the general population, not because they don't understand it. I believe they understand it. The emotions that are attached to it when they see, they being the general public, when you see an incident, and there are abuses of power. We're dealing with human beings, and there's going to be good human beings and bad human beings. So you see one instance that is just, you know, a terrible incident, but then you see others. And, you know, from our perspective, I see an incident and I think to myself, I wonder how that officer's sleep patterns are. Mm-hmm. And you say that to the general community, and they're like, what? You're saying that they're acting racist because they're tired? And you think, well, that's really boiling it down without getting into any of the nuance. Then you see other instances and you think, okay, that's terrible. That I don't care how tired you were, how much sleep you got, that's out of bounds, no matter how you slice it.
Yeah.
But when you have the videos in that confirm the bias of this idea, and Professor, this is what I'm battling against. I want there to be a federal policy on sleep. Why is it that these other industries have, you know, you can't drive a truck across state lines for a certain length of time without having rest in between, but we're going to give our officers guns, metal batons, send them into volatile situations, think that we talk about de-escalation and procedural justice, and all of a sudden that's going to help them navigate it when they could have 3 hours of sleep the night before, and nobody thinks about it. They just say, good luck, have some coffee, put some dip in your mouth and press on.
Yeah. And expect them not to make mistakes. And I mean, the community is right to expect officers not to make mistakes. You know, I mean, it's really important. You know, this is an incredibly responsible job, right? I mean, yes. Eliminating mistakes is the goal, and that's what we're all kind of trying to do. But to answer your question, I think, you know, part of it, unfortunately, is you know, I think we are facing a crisis of understaffing, you know, a crisis of recruitment, of retention, and from the policing perspective, I understand why. It's not as rewarding as it was, you know. I mean, it's not as popular as it was. It's really, really problematic to expect fewer officers to do the same or more and hold them accountable to those same standards, and you know, and continue to expect perfection, which of course is probably unrealistic, but you know, that's the goal, and that's what we're striving towards, because these are you know, these are lives that we're talking about, and errors. It's not just an error in judgment. It can be, you know, catastrophic and loss of life, and ripple through you know, families and communities, and then, you know, continue to erode public trust in policing and affect the police profession further. So, you know, I mean, I certainly don't want to sound doom and gloom, but until we can really get a handle on some of the staffing issues, this is going to continue to be very, very, very difficult problem to solve.
Well, and your husband had a great line in the podcast that you both run, in the Freakonomics episode, where he said, "Do you work in a profession where 85% is good enough?" And clearly, most professions, 85% is not good. If your Amazon delivery truck driver is getting it right 85% of the time, it's not good. But at the worst, it's annoying. And it's frustrating. If officers are getting it right 85% of the time, it's truly catastrophic. Because when you look at these big numbers, these tens of millions of interactions, and the low occurrences of force, you are now getting into single percentages. And even when you're getting it right 98% of the time, you see even what 1-2% can be. And then you get into shootings, right? And now you're talking fractions of a percentage. But the appetite and the tolerance from the community is very low, even for that. They want near perfection.
Yeah, because I mean, of course, for that family, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how infrequent it is, in the grand scheme of things. It's no less devastating. So no, I mean, I do understand and empathize with that, and I completely agree with Steve. I mean, policing is a 100% profession. It's one of those professions that officers, we need to strive for perfection all the time. I mean, we that's just a reality of it, and I know that might seem unfair, but it is one of those jobs that mistakes are just, they're so enormous, they're so potentially enormous. So
it's the representation of a government, government that's, we are, the police are the most visible form of this. And we have guns on our hips, and there's that tacit, that subliminal authority, that subliminal power structure. No matter where you go, you have a gun on you to enforce laws. And so I didn't understand that before I got more educated on these things. And now I understand even the implicit and explicit, projection, the image and the impression. Now, something you touched on this with the staffing. This was an issue in 2019 when I was doing my doctoral work. And now it's only gotten worse. So I thought this was bad in 2019 before everything kind of went off the rails. But let's just hold for that moment. Prior to that, so the 2019, I came across someone I found to be incredibly impactful, who's been talking about this for decades, and maybe even perhaps a mentor of yours. Is it Brian Vila?
Vila, yes.
Vila.
Brian, absolutely adore him.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. A wonderful person, wrote the book Tired Cops. It literally, and the studies, my dissertation committee, when I was going through my process, they said, we notice you have this name an awful lot. So Brian Vila, I'm sorry, you said Vila?
Vila,
like Violet, Brian Vila. So Brian, and then, Professor Dinges. And they're like, we notice these names are there. And I said, yes, because these are the two people that have done the most work. You have somebody who wrote a book called Tired Cops. You have somebody who coined the phrase power nap. Like, if you're going to do a study, these are the two names you want attached. And they're, he has a TED talk on this. Why is it that someone that has done so much good work and he's been on a TED stage, why is it that it hasn't gotten the attention of academia the way I think it should? Why do we not have the Kennedy School and Harvard? They talk a little bit about it, but there's no push for this. When I was promoting it, I remember my committee said, so what you're trying to tell me is you're going to write a paper on trying to justify racist behavior because cops don't get enough sleep. And they just, these are academics. These are smart people. But because of the media narrative or the lack of good information, this is not like a thing. Why is that?
And I have so much difficulty in what you just said, just triggered something in me with this kind of fundamental misunderstanding that people have between justification and explanation. I mean, we want to know what the causes are of bad behavior and mistakes, right? We want to know that. We want to know why is it that sometimes officers go off the rails, either, apparently intentionally or not, in order to be able to address it and fix it. That does not mean we're trying to justify why
Yeah.
mistakes are made. I mean, for me, there's a kind of real fundamental difference. I mean, when I see, even the kind of the, really, really catastrophic mistakes that are very, very public and so on, I always want to know, what shift was the officer working? How
Yes.
little sleep were they operating under? I don't want to know that because I'm trying to excuse it. I'm trying to know it to try and, prevent it from happening again. So, I find that so interesting. And I think that is a kind of a fundamental misunderstanding that a lot of people have.
So your husband's work and Professor Brian's work, Professor Dinge's, all these great minds are together. You're running labs, you're doing real data, real tests, and I still can't seem to convince people that this is an issue. Like, I don't even get a seat at the table to talk about this, even in our own force investigations
Sure.
that we do in policing, even at like the cop level. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about like police culture.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so
Part of it is stigma, for sure. Part of it is stigma.
aren't we maybe getting in our own way sometimes as a profession?
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely still just, I mean, mental health generally, it's becoming more acceptable to talk about it in policing. It's becoming more acceptable to talk about, the rampant rates of suicide and mental health concerns and sleep deprivation and so on. But there's still this underlying kind of perception or belief that if you sign up for this job, you need to be able to just suck it up. That it's a difficult job. It's going to be stressful. You're going to work shifts. You're going to be tired. You're going to have to figure all that out. Right. And that's really not the case. I mean, yes, it is the case that it's stressful and that you'll have to work shifts and so on. But it's not the case that there aren't resources out there that can help. And we see this devastating trend of officers retiring and then dying not long after, kind of 7 years or so later.
Right.
And that is this kind of long-term accumulation of chronic sleep deprivation and chronic stress that increases the risk of, pretty much every major disease and shortens lifespan. So, when I hear officers kind of saying, well, it's just a reality of the job and that's just, what I'm going to have to do. It's not. It's not. Everybody can, any officer, even with overtime, even with extended shifts and so on, it is possible to get sufficient sleep.
Right.
If it's not, then that's essentially illegal, right? I mean, a department cannot not allow an officer to get sufficient sleep between shifts, right? Yeah. They cannot force somebody to work to that extent. So if an officer at that point is taking on so much overtime, then they are prioritizing not getting enough sleep. And this is where I can be not overly popular, because I'll talk to officers about this and they'll say, but oh my, especially coming up to retirement, my pension's going to be based on that. And it's like, okay, but you're going to have barely any time to do anything with it. And what's your quality of life going to look like? So at some point, you need to rethink some of these priorities and realize that if you don't get sufficient sleep, nothing else is going to work.
And so I've started implementing this training at the ground level. I teach the youngest officers, because when you were young on the job, you were incentivized. It was a badge of honor to work overnight till, say, 7 a.m, to get lucky enough to have a court case that starts at 8:30, because that's all overtime for you. And if that court case went till noon, 2, 3 o'clock, you're not sleeping. You're just sitting around waiting. And now you got about maybe 5 hours left between the time the court ends and your next shift begins. And you take a nap in your car in the parking lot, or you go to the cot room and you get a few winks, and now you're awake and it's almost like you're bragging, like, oh, I made this much in overtime. I just turned in a 6-hour overtime report. And the culture was that's good. What I'm trying to teach officers is you're paying for this. There's the 55, 60-year-old of you is out there on a timeline, and you're going to meet that person. And when you do, you don't want to meet them and they have 3 years of life left. They have diabetes, the onset of dementia or some cognitive impairment, and all that work will be for nothing. Mm-hmm. But it's hard for that young brain to see that far away.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So with that, so that's a systemic problem. I hear systemic problems in policing, mm-hmm. and I look at it from a different perspective. That's a systemic problem. The fact that if I saw 3 officers do 2 shots of whiskey right mm-hmm. before they went out on patrol, I would have a moral and legal imperative to stop them mm-hmm. and say, no, you're not allowed. But if those same officers all said, we got 3 hours of sleep last night and we're going out on patrol, I have no imperative. Furthermore, I have no incentive to stop them. I just have to hope for the best.
Yeah. And I do believe that, just like 50 or 60 years ago, I mean, your example of somebody kind of taking a couple of shots, having a few beers and coming to work, I mean, that was maybe not the norm, but certainly not all that frowned upon, right? So, I mean, I do think that we will get to a point in society, we'll get to a point with policing where fatigue and sleep deprivation will follow in the same way. And I'm really hopeful, hopefully not 50 or 60 years from now, that people will look back and they'll be like, well, you could be awake for, 24 more hours, essentially, if you're blowing the equivalent of a 0.1 and then weaponed up and out you go, So I do think we'll get to a point where people will look back and have the same kind of, are you crazy mentality that we have about drinking on the job now before the job.
So a few questions that I have just for like the straightforward answer. We can now say without a doubt, and this is a hard bar to hit, but sleep deprivation causes cognitive impairment. Not correlated, it causes. Can we make that claim?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, so we can now make that claim. Number 2, do we know, this is from a lot of Matthew Walker's work. We know that we have the morning lark and the night owl and these things. Do you ever see a space where we can test for that and then say, look, you're predisposed for this. You will actually do well as a night owl. And then we start measuring people's, their biorhythms, their circadian biorhythms, and maybe align them towards that part of those shift workers. Do you ever see a space for that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the departments that I do work with in terms of fatigue risk management strategies, that's one kind of the various points that I always try and hit. One is on duty napping, which is often met, people are absolutely appalled by the idea that I'm a huge advocate and champion of on-duty napping. I'll come back to that. But the other is matching workers to shifts. So it's exactly what you're talking about, and it's hard to get past the, bidding by seniority, which is how it's, it's always done, right? And I get it. I get that, you've been there for a while, you've paid your dues, you should get to pick the shift that you want. But I do also think that, kind of educating officers about what their natural kind of morningness and eveningness looks like and how they'll do on the various shifts can definitely inform part of that policy. So I work with departments and it's very straightforward. There's a morningness, eveningness questionnaire that you can download freely online. And that will tell you enough, there's really no additional measurement needed, right? I mean, it's super straightforward. And we just have all the officers in the department take this little quick questionnaire and just kind of let them, it can just help in the process of their selection, because there are going to be some officers who actually find days harder than nights, especially if they're having to get up at 5 a.m. and they're extremely, they're extreme evening types.
Yeah,
right?
That was an interesting point that your husband talked about, is there are people who will feel the same cognitive impairment if you get them up too early. Like their natural rhythm doesn't necessarily align with the rising and setting of the sun.
Yeah, exactly. No, there are some people who do really well on nights. And for those, what I tend to kind of focus on in terms of education is, just because you feel well or better on shift than others might doesn't mean you don't need to kind of focus on still getting enough sleep, right? So
Yes.
with them, then it's all about split sleep schedules, because for most people it's going to be impossible for on night shift to get enough consolidated sleep in one block. So we tend to kind of try and get people to come off nights as quickly as feasible, get to bed, get to sleep, all that great stuff with sleep hygiene, block out light, block out sound, have the bed, the bedroom space nice and cold, and get as much sleep as you can, which for most is not going to be more than about 4 or 5 hours. That is not enough, right? I know a lot of people are going to be listening to this being like, I'm lucky if I get that, but right. It is not enough to prevent long-term sleep restriction that, like I said, kind of adds to your risk of disease and so on and so forth. So it's really important to get that additional kind of hour or two before you go out again on shift.
So this is a question I get asked a lot, and I'm looking for the definitive answer. Well, yeah, I work my 312 or my 410, but I catch up on sleep on the weekends. I catch up. And from what I've looked at, there is no catching up. Can you explain a little bit of that, why there is no catching up per se?
Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting one, because there is and there isn't. So, I mean, we sleep debt can certainly be paid back. But, I mean, to use your example, if somebody's working their 312s and for whatever reason, they're getting kind of 3, maybe 4 hours sleep, and that's it across that 78-hour period, then even kind of what we call a saturation sleep. So you kind of you get off and you sleep. And even if you can, sleep for 12, 13, 14 hours, which some people can, it's going to bring you back to about 80%. Right. So, I mean, not horrible, but like we're consistently saying, policing is not an 80% profession. It's probably going to make you safe-ish, right? But it's not going to be beneficial in terms of preventing your risk for problems down the road and so on and so forth. So it's better to try and prevent that need, that, better to not let that sleep debt build up to that extreme extent. But, I mean, somebody working nights is unlikely to get 8 hours of sleep
right
per 24-hour period. I mean, it's possible, but I mean, you're really having to work on it and not doing much else in between, right? So I don't want people to get too caught up in the idea of like, oh God, I can't top up or pay back at all. You can just try not to get to that extreme fatigued state.
So, and I explain it like this, and I have an expert, so I want to see if this is a decent analogy. So the way I explain it is, sure, we could get you back to baseline, right? If you've been up for 24 hours, you're going to need some sleep. And when you wake up, you're going to feel better than you were when you went to sleep, 8 hours ago or 6 hours ago. But I explain it like this. If you flex a muscle or if you're working out, you have a byproduct, and that byproduct tends to be lactic acid. The muscle burns, you need to stop, recover. Okay. The brain has a metabolic byproduct as well. Just like lactic acid needs to be flushed out, the brain has sort of plaque and debris that is a byproduct of processing. Now, if you miss sleep or if you fail to get enough sleep, that byproduct doesn't get washed away. And so what ends up happening is you do that for 2 or 3 days. Now that byproduct, that plaque, it doesn't all get cleaned off. It's like brushing your teeth, right? So I brush my teeth, but if I skip, it's okay, because every 6 months I go to the dentist, they take a metal tool and they scrape off the plaque. Well, when you miss your sleep, that metabolic byproduct wedges in there, and that's what we see helps accelerate, the cognitive impairment processes. So that's how I explain to them.
Exactly.
Right? You may feel better, but just understand, like, that's a debt that will be paid because you can't catch up. It's not like you could sleep for 12 hours and the adenosine gets come out and it washes everything away and now it's nice and clean. You missed the opportunity to get that byproduct when you could, and now it's lodging in there. Is that reasonable?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where we see the connection between chronic sleep restriction and Alzheimer's, for example. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really, it's not just cardiovascular disease. It's not just metabolic. And we always used to think along those lines when we thought about sleep restriction and, kind of what it does for weight and diabetes and so on, and risk of heart attack. It's not just those. It's also things like Alzheimer's. It's increased risk of all the mental health concerns.
Right.
I mean, obviously increased risk of all the sleep disorders, which are fairly fairly prevalent in this professional group.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to be mindful, and we need to be educating officers about what those risks are, because it has to factor in to their decision-making process about prioritizing. And sleep at least has to be considered in that equation. And often, historically it wasn't. It was one of those things that like, oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead.
Yeah, right.
And the skeptic in me is like, okay, well, that won't be very long. So that's not too far in the future if you continue down this path.
That is 100%. Absolutely. So what about the officer who says, I feel fine, I do good? Matthew Walker said, if you took the general population and rounded up to the next number, the next whole number of people who can operate on 5 or less hours of sleep, the number would be 0. Like, this is how rare this number is. But you have officers who feel, because it's very difficult to measure that cognitive impairment, because they feel alert and they say, no, I'm fine. I could go on 5 hours sleep. I got my Bang, I got my coffee, I got my whatever Monster. Mm-hmm. How do you reach them to say, well, I know you feel well, or is there a test I could give them to show that their cognitive impairment is actually there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there are several tests, but to answer the first part, I think that oftentimes officers are just accustomed. They're used to feeling that way, right? Mm-hmm. So they mistake it as being normal, right? They consider it their new normal. I can't tell you the number of times that I've done surveys and seen, these astronomically high rates of anxiety and depression and PTSD and so on. And then you kind of look at ratings of quality of life, and it's like, oh yeah, you're pretty good. and it's like, how is that, that you think that that's normal, that you think that that's okay. And it's just, again, it's just kind of one of these cultural expectations that it's just, it's a tough job, suck it up. Right. if you're not okay with it, find something else to do. And that's just such a damaging attitude, because we shouldn't see these rates, right? I mean, yes, policing is always going to be a stressful job. That's why stress management is so important. Yes, we're always going to have shifts. That's why fatigue management is so important. So I think that's kind of a really, really important thing to remember, is that, just because you're used to something doesn't mean that it's the way that things should be.
Right. I wrote it down because I'm going to say that in the training. The tolerance is not a sign of health.
No,
like, just being able to tolerate something is not a sign of health. So the idea of the REM sleep and the NREM sleep, as I understand it, that deep REM sleep, this is where people in general can regulate emotions, these hard emotions, these memories that are there. And when officers get that light sleep and they don't get into the deep sleep, so maybe they slept for 5 hours, but they never access that REM deep sleep, they're not helping themselves sort of shave down those stressful encounters. And then they get this hypervigilance because they're it's almost like a PTSD. Is that am I trending in the right way when I think about that?
Yeah. So, when we think about sleep, and obviously, our sleep, we kind of cycle through these different phases, which is what you're saying, I know. And, we go from kind of light sleep, the kind of the alpha, theta, and then we go down from there into delta, which is that deep sleep. And then from there, we kind of transition to REM, to rapid eye movement, kind of dream sleep, and then back up into light sleep. And so that cycle continues. And the way that it typically works is, the first part of our sleep period, we spend more time in delta, which is that kind of that really, really deep sleep. Mm-hmm. Right. And less time in REM. And then as the night goes on and that kind of core core sleep is met, we spend more and more time in REM. Now, there's still a great deal about sleep that we don't know, but the major theories are that, the kind of the delta, that deep sleep, is what we need for kind of restoration, right? That's really, really important for the body, right? Mm-hmm. REM, that dream sleep, is kind of that memory consolidation piece. So really, really important for the kind of more the mental, right? Yeah. Really important for the brain. So, when we take somebody, for example, who struggles with some PTSD symptomology, with some hypervigilance, it can be really difficult for them to get that delta, right? Because they have difficulty relaxing enough. So they're kind of bouncing between light sleep and dream sleep, which is, problematic, obviously, with nightmares and so on, but they're not really getting enough of that deep delta core restorative sleep. So yes, I mean, and that's not to indicate that REM sleep isn't important. Of course it is, it's critically important, but anecdotally, at least, the issue that we seem to see most with officers is, not getting enough of delta, of that core sleep.
And then you get this self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating negative cascade, because you can't get into the delta because you have the stress and the anxiety. And so you can't get deep in there to start managing and mitigating and maybe shaving off the edges of that anxiety. And then it just perpetuates, and then they don't get sleep, and then they're slightly cognitive impaired, and then they're thrown into another tense situation. And you can see this, like, now that I've done a little bit more work with like the neuroscience of the brain, you can see when people are in these states. An example, drop the knife, repeated 30, 40 times in a row.
Yeah.
You could see, like, okay, I now know your prefrontal cortex is not engaged. Your amygdala's running the show. And I'm as a citizen, I'm expecting you to do this. But as the officer, the option to change course isn't even coming into their consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. They're not even thinking of a better option. But now seeing the video, we're judging them by saying, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but I'm just trying to paint the picture. We're judging them by saying, well, why didn't you just do this? And the answer is because that thought never even occurred to them.
Couldn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so it does stress inoculation training actually work?
There's unfortunately very little evidence to show that it does, and there's actually, there's some evidence to show that it's problematic, right?
Detrimental.
So it's detrimental. It's one of those things. I mean, it's one of those things, like, the idea behind it makes sense, right? I mean, things are going to be stressful, so let's put officers in really, really stressful situations. And I mean, to an extent, with simulation training and whatnot, it's important that it be realistic. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you want it to be realistic. You want it to evoke,
the emotion.
Some of the emotions, because you want to be able to practice under those kind of conditions. But unfortunately, what a lot of trainers do is they take that, they go from there to thinking, oh, well, I'm going to run an officer, till they're exhausted, and then make them do this and make them do that. And I'm going to, not so much in policing as in the military, but, we're just going to keep people up for however many days and then make them do this. And there's very little to show that that's beneficial, right?
Yeah. And yet it's accepted. It's accepted practice that I'm going to treat an officer sort of, I don't know, like without dignity in the academy. We're going to hammer them on the most minor thing, because if they can't take the abuse in the academy, they're not going to take it in the field. Yeah. And I think, how about we model the behavior and we say, here's how you de-escalate. Yeah. Oh, you made an honest mistake and you forgot your book, or you didn't shave all the way. Let's talk you through this so that when the officer goes to the field, the very first knowledge they have of policing is yelling and ordering people. And maybe they could say, oh, I know how to mitigate this. But it's like, we can't break the tradition and the culture that because in order to get more sleep in this profession, we're going to have to break some cultural norms, like take them off the grid completely.
Oh, yeah. And I think, one of the, and again, this is a little bit of a controversial one, but one of the things that we see not in all academies, but in most, is this extreme emphasis on officer safety first. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that's obviously officer safety is critical, but you cannot expect a young recruit to take in a lesson on de-escalation when the first part of that lesson is continually showing them videos of officers being assaulted, right? And that is still fairly commonplace in the academy, right? I mean, it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to talk about de-escalation, but know that if it really goes down, it's unimportant, right? I mean, then it's not a skill, then it's not a core skill that you're actually teaching. I mean, there has to be a way of teaching effective communication, de-escalation, procedural justice, and so on, without sacrificing, obviously, safety. And, I mean, we always need to have officers be aware of their surroundings and so on and so forth. But this kind of continual message that, okay, well, when things are going right, that's when things like de-escalation and implicit bias and procedural justice are important, those soft skills, right? When they're important. And when things are going wrong, the only thing that matters is that you win. Right. Yes. I would say that during those times when, things are hitting the fan, right? Those are the times when it is the most important to remember those lessons, right? Because those lessons are going to keep you in control. Yeah. So,
yeah, that is I've been trying to weave this in because you hear soft skills, hard skills, kinder, gentler. And what I've been trying to say is no more is there a time for procedural justice when your gun is pointing at somebody? Yeah. Because the risk is so high right now on both sides of this. Mm-hmm. And you need to keep that brain functioning. So procedural justice, yeah, we couch it as a soft skill, but just as you eloquently said, it is the foundation of the hard skills. Because if we're just acting on pure emotion all the time, well, good luck. We're now rolling the dice and hoping it turns out.
One of the very best examples of de-escalation and procedural justice and so on that I've ever seen was from a video of an officer-involved shooting, and unfortunately, it really was the only option available to the officer. This guy, terribly sad, kind of meant some significant mental health issues, but was kind of very, very close to his family with a knife. And I mean, it just was, there was no other option, Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a very valiant attempt at trying to find another alternative, but it didn't work out. And the example of de-escalation that I thought was so powerful was after the officer had shot the suspect, went over, obviously, removed the knife. And the interaction that this officer had with that person then was very, very powerful and recorded via body camera. And, it was just this officer kind of saying, what's your name? Tell me about your family. They really want to see you. We're going to make it through this, obviously, while rendering aid and so on. And this gentleman survived. And that video was actually very beneficial for police community relations, despite the fact that, potentially lethal force was engaged. So, I mean, oftentimes we kind of think that de-escalation exclusively means that force won't be required. And sometimes that's not the case. It's just, treating people like human beings worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of circumstances.
If you can offline, if you could send me the link to that, I would love to see that and see how I can implement it. Mm-hmm. And you are 100% correct. And you just gave me a new way to think about this, which is de-escalation is often put forth as how to not get into a use of force. Mm-hmm. And why didn't the officer de-escalate? But you've just explained an example when deadly force, the highest level of force, was in fact used, but de-escalation was still a part of this through the event. Yeah. Not just at this moment, but then afterwards as well. Because that's what you see. And I think that doesn't win our profession many favors. When officers shoot somebody, they're on the ground and they have multiple bullets in them. And there's this pause because of officer safety. And like I tell my cops, if this person gets up right now and starts walking at you, we've got bigger problems. Like the zombie apocalypse is now happening because clearly they're down.
Yeah.
Four of us can walk up to this person.
Yeah.
But it is like this pause and wait, and just in case they're faking it or something. But like you say, it is beaten into the officers' heads that officer safety is paramount.
And I would say that there's very little that's more damaging to public perceptions than seeing somebody who's been shot and officers standing around. And I mean, I know that sometimes there might be a reason for it and so on, but sure. the general public's not going to know that, and unfortunately it just looks like, well, we really don't care. And again, I know that's not the case. I know that officers by and large, they are. They're empathetic and so on and so forth. I mean, for the most part, people don't get into this profession unless they do want to help people and serve society. So, but yeah, I mean, the visual piece is unfortunately all the more important today, especially with, just the knowledge that everything's being recorded, whether that's body cam or people's cell phones or CCTV or whatever it might be. So public perceptions are very important.
So, Professor, we talk a lot about police fatigue, police shooting and whatnot, but another issue that we are overrepresented in traffic fatalities. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of damage done to citizens, the community at large, and officers with traffic fatalities. Yeah. And you could imagine when you're hurling yourself, at 88 feet a second, through space and time, and you're on 3 or 4 hours of sleep, 0.5 seconds is equivalent to 40, 50 feet of travel time before you recognize something. Mm-hmm. Do you have any research, or have you done research on traffic collisions and policing and sleep deprivation?
Yes, so Steve's done most of this. My husband, he's done some great work on drowsy driving, distracted driving, and most importantly, the interaction between those two, right? Because we know that we know from a lot of data kind of what the equivalent is in terms of you've been up for however many hours and what that looks like in terms of the equivalency in blood alcohol content. Yeah. And we know, of course, that distracted driving is bad. Most states, I think actually all states have distracted driving laws. Most of them, if not all of them, exempt emergency vehicle drivers, which is kind of ironic. Right. But yeah, so I mean, it's not unusual at all to see officers, obviously getting information from their MDTs, from their mobile data terminals, whatever that might be. Potentially from their phones as well as they're being expected to scan for this, that, and the other. Right. And that combination of distraction and fatigue is really, really problematic, right? So I mean, Steve's definitely the person to talk to about That's that. Great. He's done great studies. He looked at a decade worth of data from the entire state of California. In terms of any officer involved collision that had damage of, I think, more than $500. So pretty much all officer involved collisions. Yeah. And he looked at the circumstances of those, and I mean, for the most part, they're happening under decent light conditions. No alcohol intoxication, thankfully. Right. I mean,
no weather issues.
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, just one person, they're not happening in pursuits and whatnot. They're happening because officers are falling asleep at the wheel and driving into a tree or whatever it might be.
And this is something that never, it seems to get captured. And I'll be curious if your husband has the rate of officers driving home from work, because now you're off duty. And this is something I go into a classroom and I say, how many of you have ever nodded off driving home? You get about 50%. How many of you ever showed up at home? You don't even remember getting off the freeway. Yeah. You usually get everyone's hands.
Most of them, yeah.
Right. And so you say, okay, and those of you that didn't raise your hand, that didn't nod off, it's only because your memory doesn't remember you nodding off. Yeah. Because if we had a little camera on your rearview mirror, you'd see those micro sleeps and you'd see them nodding off for a quarter of a second or, whatever, 0.3 of a second. But it's happening at a crazy rate. But I don't think the profession captures that data because, well, that's off duty. But
no, exactly.
right? It's because of the duty. It's because of what we put them through. I remember what it's like to work a 4-day stretch and you're overtime every day and you just can't wait to get home, and you get home and you don't remember getting there. Like that can't be a sign of health and safety for the community around me that I don't remember driving home.
Yeah, and this is this is not unique to policing. I mean, this is shift work generally. The most dangerous time of a shift worker's life, even for a profession like policing, which is a dangerous profession, is that post-shift drive home.
Wow.
That is, and we just finished a big study with nurses looking at kind of safety risks of working kind of 3 consecutive 12s, and then and put them in one of our driving simulators and have them do a kind of simulated post-shift drive home, and especially for working consecutive nights. That's when we see the those micro sleeps and those kind of extreme lane deviation, those collision predictors. Wow. And when we do the education around these types of issues, one of the things that we talk about is well, why is there this apparent kind of comfort level that people have with falling asleep at the wheel and so on? And in part, unfortunately, it's because we get away with it for the most part, right? I mean, we wake from that little micro sleep and nothing has happened, so we're just like, oh, I just need to push through. It's just another 10, 15, 20, whatever it might be, minutes to get home. But where I always kind of go, not to be overly morbid, is like, well, what happens if you have one of those micro sleeps at the same minute, at the same moment that a dog runs across the road or a kid runs across the road? I mean, can you imagine being in that situation? And can you imagine anything that is worth that? Right. And getting home, is not worth that, right? You need to just, if you're feeling yourself nodding off at the wheel, you have got to pull over in a safe space and sleep for 10 minutes, right? You just have to. There's no other option, because nothing is worth that.
You're 100% correct. And the problem too is if you show up to a scene of an accident and they say what happened, and my driver one says, I'm sorry, I just fell asleep. Like, okay, that's an accident. But if I got out there and there was a bottle of alcohol, they'd be in handcuffs going to jail. But they say, well, I just fell asleep. Well, maybe we need to have more responsibility as a species, as a society, to say this is no longer socially acceptable. Like if you're fatigued, but that would, again, we're going to break the doors off the culture, the American culture of we press on and, just get 2 of these as you go.
Right. I think we're getting there because it's becoming that way more so with the public, right? I mean, we're thinking more, if somebody gets in an accident, not an officer, but a member of the general public, it's kind of one of the things that's considered. Kind of drowsy driving is becoming more recognizable. So I think that it's starting there. I think we will get to the point where it infiltrates the emergency services as well.
Yeah. And at the very least, we're going to create cars that have emergency braking and take us out of it. And just do it. So I want to be aware of your time. I want to be cognizant of that. And I'm so appreciative you spent some time with me. If you could give some takeaways to maybe the officers who are listening, like just maybe some little tidbits for them to say, look, you're working night watch. Here's some things you absolutely should do to maximize the sleep.
Yeah, I think, well, a couple of things is do please download that morningness, eveningness questionnaire. Knowing yourself is really important. Having that information is really critical. Whether I'm not sure how much officers are going to have a say in the shifts that they have, but to the extent that you can, that's really, really useful information. If you are assigned to nights, that idea of kind of split sleep is really important. So get off shift, try and get as much as you can, then get a nap before you go back on. It's too much to get into, but if anybody is interested in terms of, we like to talk about consistency in sleep schedules, which is tricky for night shift workers, because obviously you don't want to stay on a nocturnal schedule during your time off, but it is possible to do it in a phased way, right? So you have your on-duty schedule, your transition schedule, and your off-duty schedule,
Oh,
and just try
nice.
and be consistent with that. So I do a lot of work with departments around kind of setting up what that might look like to give people a guideline or some help. Um,
Okay.
and then just in terms of some real simple kind of sleep hygiene, that kind of making the
Hmm.
best of your bed space for the best possible sleep opportunity, and that really is about cool, dark, quiet. Those are the important things. So
Okay, good. So I'm on the right path with this. And then the last question I get now, I'm going to leave you with this before we say goodbye. An officer will say, if I have enough time to get in a workout or an extra hour of sleep, what should I do? And I always push for the sleep. What would you say?
yeah, I mean, I would agree. Exercise is a great way of kind of promoting wakefulness. Certainly,
Hmm.
so I mean, a quick exercise session can definitely have a strong alerting factor because, of course, it's raising body temperature and so on. But we know that prioritizing exercise over sleep, you're actually not going to be getting the benefit from exercise that you think you are, right? So,
Okay.
we do see people who, despite all the exercise, despite the good nutrition and so on, still struggle with weight and whatnot because they're not getting the sleep that they need.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I want to be very cognizant of your time, and we're coming up just over an hour. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for spending the time with me. And truly, it was an honor. It's like a sports fan getting to meet the athlete when the academic gets to meet the scholar that they cited in their work. So thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you. This has been fabulous conversation, and I really appreciate you reaching out and giving me the platform.
Absolutely. And then maybe if I can offline, you could forward my email to your husband. I'd like to do a little bit more on the
Yes,
drowsy driving.
absolutely. Yeah, no, he's the lead expert in police drowsy driving for sure.
Excellent. Well, Professor, thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to future conversations with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Take care.
You as well. Bye bye.